well get started. I'm very glad to have you all here with me on Zoom this evening. And my name is Meldon Jenkins Jones. I'm the law librarian at the Richmond Public Law Library. This is a public library event, and this is the first day of Black History Month 2021, and it promises to be an exciting year. Our theme for Get Lit this year is Black History. And everyone always says, oh, Black History Month, that's not enough time. Why do we only have a month? So we decided, okay, let's see what that looks like if we take it all year. So that's what we're doing. And we're looking forward to an exciting year. We have a full lineup for this month, and we're just now adding programs for the rest of the year. So if any of you would like to make a return visit, please do so. Just let me know. Without further ado, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Get Lit. Get Lit is an umbrella for the literacy programs at the library. They're basically pointed towards reluctant readers. And we started out in 2015 with a summer program. And then in 2016, we had our first Black History Month program, which is a citywide program, not just the main branch where I am. BMER was started by the diverse, or the librarians of color at the Richmond Public Library. There weren't a lot of us, and there are even fewer of us now. But we thought it was important to address the needs of the Black boys, especially, who were not reading up to par or graduating on time or what have you. So since then, we have a new director, Scott Firestein, and he said, why don't we make it more diverse? So we included girls and a book club run by the North Avenue branch librarian, Diane Wilmore, who is a librarian of color, and she started the Lit Chicks Read program. And of course, lit is a play on words, literature, and lit is a popular slang word that means, great, exciting, wonderful. And so, and we have a few other programs, Books, Boys, and Barbershops, Babes, Beauty Shops and Books, and Real Men Read. And so we're basically the librarians who choose to get involved. And we do have an advisory committee made up of the librarians and whatever citizens would like to be involved. And we're looking to expand our board from 10 to 15. So if you know of anyone who would like to be a member of the advisory group, I say board, but it's not really a board, it's a committee. Let them know. We're especially looking for men of color. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists. First, we have LaKesa Cox. She is an author and screenwriter from Richmond, Virginia, with over 20 years of writing experience. She has released 4 adult fiction novels, contributed to 3 award-winning anthologies, a children's book, and a historical fiction young adult novel, which is Mulatto Girl Aggie 13, Name on the Ledger. Ms. Cox has also written 6 feature-length screenplays and is currently shopping them for optioning with networks and streaming platforms. She was named one of the top 100 African-American authors of 2017 by UBAWA.org and is currently working on an adult novella and her next script. You can check out her work at www.LaKesa.com. LaKesaCox.com. That's LaKesaCox.com. Or follow her on social media, LaKesa Cox-author on Facebook and at I am LaKesa on Instagram. Would you care to say a few words?
Yes. Hi, everybody. And it's LaKesa Meldon.
LaKesa, I'm sorry.
That's okay. But yeah, I am LaKesa Cox from Richmond, Virginia, born and raised. And Mulatto Girl Aggie 13 is my very first historical fiction book that I've ever written. It is also my first young adult novel. So it's very interesting to be here with some additional historical fiction writers to kind of talk about the process, because it was a challenge for me being a contemporary fiction author, having to write historical fiction. So thank you for the invite.
Great to have you. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Now we have Rebekah L. Pierce. She is here to empower and inspire women to live in their purpose through the arts and advocacy. A former English teacher, playwright, advocate for women, and a veteran, she has worked extensively to empower and uplift women and families who face monumental issues to their spiritual, physical, emotional, and financial well-being. Pierce refers to herself as a socially conscious author and speaker, in that much of her work revolves around issues that impact the quality of life for women and their families. Rebekah is a lover of mystery novels that feature protagonists who fight their personal demons as they save the day. She is the author of 2 historic fiction novels, Murder on 2nd Street and The Second Life of Lucy Bosman. In February 2019, Rebekah released I Love Me More, her memoir on the freeing power of self-love. She also bakes cupcakes and cookies too for virtual baker Maggie's Cupcake Cafe. In February 2020, she launched her cooking show Beyond the Plate RVA on RLP Productions YouTube channel, where she showcases the culinary skills and talents of some of Richmond's finest unknown chefs and bakers. Visit www.RebekahLPierce.com. That's REBEKAHLPIERCE, or www.rlpproductions.com to learn more about Rebekah and her work, as well as upcoming projects. Follow her on Facebook at https://www.facebook.com/Rebekah.L.Pierce and facebook.com/RLP Productions. Twitter at Rebekah Pierce or at Productions RLP, and on IG at Rebekah Lynn Pierce. Maggie's Cupcake Cafe is also on Facebook and IG at Maggie's Cupcake Cafe. To schedule, well, if you want to schedule her for a speaking engagement, you can contact her. And without further ado, I'd like to hear a few words.
God, I hate hearing my bio read. Ugh. And I have to make a correction.
I had only known.
Right? And I have to make a correction. I'm not a former English teacher. I somehow still got wrapped back up into teaching. So I'm still teaching. And I teach literature. I teach African-American literature, women's lit, humanities, pretty much anything in the world of lit, including drama, British lit, and all that. I'm teaching it. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I look forward to having the conversation about historic fiction, which I love as both a writer and a teacher. So I look forward to having this conversation as well.
Great. Thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
And now, without further ado, we would introduce Robin Farmer. Robin's critically acclaimed YA novel, Malcolm and Me, was a 2019 winner of the She Writes Press and Spark Press Toward Equality in Publishing, STEP contest. A national award-winning journalist, Robin specialized in narrative nonfiction products as part of the Special Projects Investigative Team for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Her work led to a Knight Wallace Fellowship at the University of Michigan. A freelance writer since 2009, her clients include corporations and universities. Robin holds a degree in journalism from Marquette University. She lives near Richmond with her fantastic husband and is working on her second novel. Robin, would you care to say a few words?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. I can't think of a better way to start off Black History Month than with book lovers in my own backyard. So thank you.
We're glad to have you. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. So we'll jump right into the questions, and we aim to finish around 7. So here we go. First question is, what interested you in writing historical fiction? Who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Yes.
So I ended up writing historical fiction because I'm so old that when I read about what happened when I was a teenager, it's considered historical fiction. It's accidental. I didn't know that I was that old, right? But that's really what happened.
Okay. Well, you know, I think I've got a few years on you, so I don't know about all of that. Yes. Same question. LaKesa?
Well, for me, what prompted me to write my story was I was actually watching the new version of Roots with one of my daughters, and she had so many questions about, you know, why didn't the slaves rebel and why won't they take over, what's happening? And I tried to explain to her that slavery wasn't just about the physical part. It was more mental than anything. And, you know, in her mind as a teenager from present day, she's like, I could never be a slave because, you know, I would do this and I would do that. So that is what kind of lit the fire under me to write this story, because my story is about a teenager from present day who goes back 200 years as a slave, and she has to adapt in that environment, knowing what she knows as a present day teen. So at the time, I really didn't realize how much work it was writing historical fiction because of all of the research that is required. You have to make sure that your facts are correct, and you have to make sure that it's relatable, that people understand it and it's realistic. So that's what prompted me to write mine, just watching Roots with my daughter and deciding to take it back there. And I learned a lot writing the book because, again, this was 200 years ago, and your details as a writer have to be spot on. So it took me months to get the details just to make sure that the book was written and people could actually relate to it once I finished it.
Wow. Very interesting. Rebekah, could you answer that question? What interested you in writing historical fiction?
Well, I've always been a reader. I mean, I think I came out of the womb with a book, but being an English teacher, I learned very early on about this thing called historical context. You cannot teach literature, and I literally teach it from the beginning, which is humanities, World Lit 1, all the way up to the present. And so how do you get a classroom of whether it's high school students or young adults in college to be able to make the connection between what happened 400 years ago and what's happening in the present? So for me, it's always been about the story, connecting it to history. And the question that I always, ask my students is, what must have been happening, that the writer decided at this moment to tell us this particular story that you're reading. So what was happening socially, what was happening politically, what was happening economically, that the writer said, I need to sit down and I need to tell this particular story. So I can't teach lit without teaching a little history, because they're intricately twined. There's really no way, in my opinion, if you're going to do a good job at teaching critical thinking and analysis, you have to be able to connect the dots between why, Jefferson and his counterparts felt so strongly about seceding from Britain, and how that translated into, the letters that Abigail Adams was writing to her husband, about, pre-revolutionary America, or what that was looking like for Oladu Equiano, who's in Britain at the time as a slave, getting ready to purchase his freedom. Like, what does that look like and why is that important? So for me, it's just a part of what I do in my daily practice of teaching the world of literature.
Fascinating, fascinating. So, Robin, can you tell us a little about your journey from being a nonfiction writer, writing freelance, to writing historical fiction?
Well, it's not really a big leap, because as a journalist, you have to have an eye for detail, an ear for good dialogue. You have to get your facts right. You have to meet deadlines. What I did as an investigative reporter was I infused my work with emotional truth. And that's what I love to do more than anything. And I think that's the biggest difference between a journalist and a fiction writer. Most journalists don't work with emotional truth, right? They just write with straight facts. But I was able to bridge that as an investigative reporter. I sort of specialized in stories that illustrated the human condition. So that's how I got away with that. So this is my first novel, and everything I learned as a journalist, I just transferred, right? Writing on deadline, having an eye for detail, getting the facts right, especially if you're writing a historical novel. There's a reference in my book to the Concorde setting a record. Well, you better get that date right, right? So I think the leap from journalism to fiction writer isn't that big.
So what prompted you to write Malcolm and Me?
So the opening chapter actually happened to me, and not to give away too much, but in the opening chapter, the student answers a question about why Thomas Jefferson signed a Declaration of Independence, and at the time he owned slaves. She said that Thomas Jefferson was a hypocrite, and her nun freaks out and hits her. This really happened to me, only in real life, I was 11 and in 6th grade. And I ended up getting suspended, and it was a very traumatic event for me that I thought about for decades. And I kind of wanted to make sense out of it, right? And to write a story where maybe the outcomes were a little bit better and the messages were a little clearer. And so that's what prompted me to write the story that started off as a screenplay, one that I actually got to Keke Palmer's agent many years ago.
Wow.
And when they said it wasn't right for Keke, I said, well, I'll just write a book. So.
Interesting.
Right.
Interesting. Well, Rebekah, you've done a lot of different things. Can you tell us a little about your journey from being a radio talk show host, the founder and publisher of Average Girl magazine, motivational speaker, and of course, an English writer, to historical fiction writer?
Well, for me, it's all storytelling, like the ability to transfer to whatever medium you're in, the story. So whether it's, talking on a radio or printing or publishing a magazine, or writing a book, it's all about how the medium or the genre in which you decide to, I teach my students, called entering the conversation. So whether you enter the conversation about politics or about abuse or about whatever, you have to figure out which is the best platform that lends itself to you having that conversation. So when I was publishing Average Girl magazine, I started publishing that magazine because my cousin was murdered. She was a victim of domestic violence. And I felt I was called to present a monthly publication that would be directed towards women, about how do we, uplift ourselves? How do we go from ordinary to extraordinary? And so the best platform for that messaging was to have this inspirational, motivational magazine. And from, doing something like that, you get the opportunity to host a radio show and bring on guests, so you can now listen instead of reading the content. Now you can listen to the content And then from my own experiences, you know, people would ask me to come and speak. So again, you know, being in front of students every day, you know, I've learned how to practice my delivery of whatever the story is that I have to tell. And having been, you know, come out with my new book, I Love Me More, with having been a victim of domestic violence, especially at the time that I was publishing the magazine, for me, it was about transparency. And so I'm kind of like Robin in that I actually started out as a journalism major too, English and journalism. And so I try to be very transparent in my storytelling, whether it's the written word or a verbal conversation. So whether I'm in front of a group of people or I'm putting out an opinion piece, an op-ed, or even a social media post, it's very clear who I am and where my position is in this conversation. And just for me, I work hard to make sure that it's clear what that position is. So again, to me, it all comes down to, I'm a storyteller, and just that stories sometimes come in different formats. So what looks good on the screen might not be good in, you know, in an in-person event, or might not fit well for a historic fiction novel or a contemporary novel, because I also write contemporary fiction as well. So again, it's just, to me, it's all about honing your craft. Like, you know, Robin began in journalism, and LaKesa, she dibbles and dabbles in different genres too. And for me, if you want to be a strong writer, you need to try your hand at different genres. And that all that does is just builds on your skill. It builds on your skill set and your craft. And to me, that's why, you know, when people say, oh my God, you write books, you write screenplays, you write plays. I'm a storyteller. And however that story comes to me, however it's supposed to be presented, I need to know how to put it in that format, in that genre. And so that's how I've been able to walk in my world, because everything for me is under my umbrella of education. If it has nothing to do with empowering or inspiring women in particular through either fiction or nonfiction, if it does not have that messaging attached to it about standing in your truth and loving who you are and walking in that, again, whether it's a fictional character or non-fictional character, I can't get involved with that, because I've learned I've learned the hard way about what my storytelling, that gift is attached to, and it's attached to truth. I mean, it's ugly sometimes, but it is what it is.
Wow. That's amazing. LaKesa, can you tell us why you chose Goochland? I think your story is set in Goochland, which is close to Richmond. Why did you choose that particular location?
Well, the teen starts out present day in Richmond. So when, of course, she, and not to give too much of the story away, when she wakes up as a slave, she is on a plantation in Goochland. I found when doing my research, Goochland had a lot of slavery plantations. There were a lot of them in and around Goochland, Virginia. Virginia, and you probably know this, but Virginia, particularly Richmond, we were like a big slavery hub. So I chose that, number one, because it was near and dear to me, because it was closer to Richmond. And number two, when I did the research, Goochland popped up for Virginia. I wanted to use Virginia because my character was from Richmond. So, and then as I dove deeper and deeper into the story and doing the research, I started to find out so much more information about what was going on here, right here in Goochland, just 200 years ago. So I just chose it because it was close by, and I felt like telling that story, you know, telling your own story when you're in a place that you lived in, Richmond being so close to Goochland. I just wanted to kind of pay homage to that. So, but yeah, Virginia, we have so much history when it comes to slavery, and I wanted to put us kind of on the map, so to speak, and that's why I chose Goochland.
Well, I wonder, for those listening, how you would start out doing that type of research. Where do you go to find out what happened so many years ago?
The
library. I got the answer.
The library. You wanted me to say library, I know.
Or you could go to, because I was not born and raised in Richmond. I'm here via the military. My background, I was stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Hampton. And I came back here when I got out in 1996 and went back home to finish my bachelor's, and then came back here, married a man, blah, blah, blah. And it was here while I was teaching African-American literature at J. Sargent Reynolds that I took my class on a field trip to the Black History Museum.
Yeah.
And while I was at the Black History Museum, I saw, this is when they were at Cary, 00 Cary Street, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I saw pictures of these affluent, well-dressed Black people. And I was like, what is this? Right? And mind you, nine out of 10 of my students were born and raised in Richmond and didn't even know they had a Black History Museum. And I was like, well, first of all, that's a trifling shame. I'm not even from here, and I know you got a Black History Museum. So I'll never forget it. The Marine, she was like, well, these are pictures of Jackson Ward. And I was like, what's a Jackson Ward? And then she started telling me about, historic Jackson Ward. These pictures were circa 1930s. This is Maggie L. Walker. And I was like, wait a minute, light bulb. I grew up reading Agatha Christie. And I started thinking, what would happen if there was a serial killer amongst these affluent people of color in Jackson Ward, 1929? How would they handle that? Because, because Jackson Ward is segregated from the city of Richmond pretty much. You got Jim Crow heavy here. And I actually pitched the idea to my students, and they were like, yeah, you need to write that. Mm-hmm. And pretty much the rest is history. You go to the Library of Virginia State Library, you go to the Maggie L. Walker Museum, you go to the Richmond Public Library, you go to the Jackson Ward Association, you Google and you find, the Valentine Museum. You try to go to these places, but I'll say for me, it was difficult when I wrote that book. When I wrote Murder on 2nd Street in 2009, I couldn't find people in town who would let me talk to them about the history of their families because I was an outsider. So I actually found that it was easier for people who were born and raised in Virginia, in Richmond, to write about the Black history here in Richmond and Virginia than it was coming from the West, because I came from California. And so when that book first came out, I had to be in those libraries. I had to be at the museums, because nobody would talk to me except the only person that would talk to me. I don't know if any of you remember him, Reverend E.G. McCreary from Virginia Union University. He was 92 at the time when he was the only one that would talk to me. And that was because my mentor, Linda McDonald, she and another friend of mine were his former students, and they convinced him to talk to me. But I had to go to all those resources because the firsthand accounts, people with the pictures from that era, people with the stories from that area, nobody would talk to me. I had to go about this in a whole other way.
Wow.
That's my story.
Wow.
It all comes down to research, though. I mean, you have to research. It takes a lot of time researching.
So look, LaKesa, was it easier for you being that you're from Richmond?
No.
Oh.
No. And keep in mind, my background has always been contemporary fiction. So you do research when you're writing fiction, but a lot of fiction when you're doing contemporary is your imagination. So you're making up a lot of stories. But when it comes to historical, you can't, you're making up the story, but you still got to make sure that your facts are correct. So it was definitely a challenge for me trying to find out historical details. Down to what the slaves would eat, what was popular for them during that time, what were they fed, and the rituals with the funerals, details like that. We know present day what a funeral looks like. You could see it in a movie present day and kind of have an idea, even if you've never been to a funeral present day. But with me not being around 200 years ago and not knowing anybody who was around 200 years ago, I had to do research. What did it look like when they had a funeral, down to the casket, the whole ritual. So yeah, it was definitely a challenge trying to do research to get the details accurate. So no.
Yeah, that's very different. She's writing slave era, and Murder on Second Street is Richmond 1929, 1930s. So I still had descendants. That's,
I had none.
well, yeah, and it would be hard for me to do that too when I wrote my second one, The Secret Life of Lucy Bosman. How do you get those details and there are no more witnesses around? But for me, that's why.
Rebekah, your second historical novel was set in what year?
In Richmond, 1861 to 1862. I'm right at the beginning and the middle of the Civil War. And so this, this character is a mulatto character, a former slave. And I wanted to tell that story that I had not seen. Who was it? Toni Morrison said, if there's a book out there that you want to read that hasn't been written, then you write it. And so I wanted to tell the other side of the story of the so-called tragic mulatto. I was sick of her being represented as either the damsel in distress or the Jezebel. So I wanted to create a female character, mulatto, who comes to Richmond because she's been left property, comes from Tennessee to Richmond because she's been left property, and what that story would look like when she comes here and she allows people to assume what she is. Because in my family, my grandfather passed. He was a very bitter man about that. And so again, teaching literature, you want to, Uncle Tom's Cabin did a horrible job to the African-American experience from the mulatto perspective in presenting their stories. And so to try to do the research on what it must have been like as a mulatto woman, freed, manumitted, coming to Richmond. What does Richmond look like at the beginning of the Civil War? And what I did was I made her a businesswoman. So I had to do that research on, were there women who were operating businesses before, during, and after the Civil War? And the answer is yes. And the question was, were they Black women or white women? They were all of that. And I actually found an address of a building that was owned by a mulatto woman. And I made that the location of my character's confectionery business. But it was, like LaKesa said, it was very difficult to find, what was the dress? What kind of confection would she be selling in a confectionery shop in pre-Civil War Richmond, right? What is she selling? What are the ingredients that are available? And if you're down there on 17 in Main, the building is in the market, the farmer's market today. That's where they brought the slaves in. What does it look like when the slaves are brought off the James River, off the boat, and marched up to Lumpkin's jail? They got to come through that main street. So what does that look like? And so you really, and for me, it's imperative that with both novels, I had my resources page. Robin knows about that, right? Getting those resources together, because what no way somebody gonna tell me that I made that up. It's like, no, ma'am, let me have my reference page. Got like 20 pages in the back of the book.
Well, Robin, that must have been a lot different for you because you were in a more modern age. Even though, what year, let me ask you, what year did your book take place?
That during the 1973-74 school year. So what I did, because certain things have to happen during the school year, I looked at the newspaper headlines to figure out what was happening in the community and what was happening in the nation and what was happening in the world, because all that plays out in the classroom sometimes with lessons. So I had to get that right. And then
where did your story take place?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Okay.
And I'm from Philadelphia, so I know something about the history of Philadelphia. But you can't let real life get in the way of a good story. So I had to be careful and walk that line, right, and make up stuff. But I also, because she's a teenager, and when you're a teenager, music is so important. So I made sure that I knew what the current hits were every month, and the current movies that they were watching, and the after school specials. They don't even have that anymore. So I had to really immerse myself, also the fashions during that school year, what's hot, what's popular for teenagers. So it was a lot of research, but it was really a lot of fun research.
Well, question. You've talked about, all three of you have talked about research for your books, but being that your characters are African-American, is the research for African-American characters any different than for the so-called mainstream characters?
I think, and I'm finding this with the readers of my book because I'm surprised by the number of older people reading it and the number of men. I think if you write a character that is emotionally true, you bridge any differences that come with age, sex, gender, religion, because emotions are universally true, right? And that's what I try to do in my book. And so my book, I think, speaks to anybody with a pulse.
Well, I'm a little, I think mine's a little bit more, well, I'll say this, Cy Sanford, first of all, my book is not YA, okay? Mine is adult. And so I created a character that is not often heard of in African-American or American literature, and that is a World War I veteran. Cy Sanford is a World War I vet. And I had to do a lot of research into what it was like for Black men to serve during World War I. And then how do you talk about PTSD when that wasn't even a thing in 1914, 1915? And then trying to describe Richmond, Maggie L. Walker, I wanted to talk more about Maggie, but I learned early on about you don't touch certain revered figures in Richmond. So I had to redirect my focus on the Cy Sanford character. How do you create a World War I vet returning from the war in Richmond, 1928, during the beginning of the fall of the stock, 29, the beginning of the stock market crash, because this novel takes place October 1929. And we know it's going to happen by October 29, 1929. The stock market's going to crash. So you got to learn a little bit about that too. But the reason why I mentioned Dr. Reverend E.G. McCreary is because when I was writing the novel and I gave him the manuscript, I had the word Black in the novel for Black people. And what Reverend McCreary came back to me and said was they were not referred to as Black, 1920s. You're going to have to change that. And that was a lesson for me, and not only being an English teacher, but being an editor, in that when you're writing historic fiction, you better use the name or the reference to the people at the time so that you can literally put the reader in that time. So I had to go back into that 300 plus word novel at the beginning and take out Black people and put Negro, nigger, nigga, colored, darky. I had to go in there and do that. And a lot of people were mad at me for that, but I'm like, it's historic fiction set in 1929 Richmond. You have to do that. And then a lot of people were like, how did you create a male character, a protagonist like that, such a troubled, angry character? You're Downing Blackman. No, that's what he was. And so I think it probably is a little bit more complex when you're building Black characters in a specific time period, because you do have to get everything that Robin said together. What is in the newspaper? Because I looked at all the Black newspapers or colored Negro newspapers at that time, like the Richmond Daily, the Planet. And you've got to know what's going on in the news. You got to know what's going on with music. I had to find out what was going on in the world politically on a larger scale. Why were the Black newspapers in Richmond not talking about what was happening in New York at the stock market? Well, because they didn't think it was going to affect them, but it did, right? So trying to create these nuanced characters, and I have a character that's modeled after John Mitchell, who did not, it has a very mixed history here in Richmond. And how do you, create characters around people who are real, or even create fake people around a period that is real? So I think you got to really do your research when you're trying to tackle, I think, characters of color, people of color, BIPOC, whatever you want to refer to it as, when you're putting them in historic fiction. You better have that speech correct.
But also what you said about you had called him Black, certain eras have a certain way of speaking. Mm-hmm. It's a certain language. Like my kid is in the 70s. We talked a little bit differently then. And I'm not just talking about slang words. I'm talking about words that you just don't hear anymore that were prevalent back then. Sayings that we said all the time back then that you don't hear anymore.
Job.
Which language is she?
And that was one of the things with my character, because she is a middle grade young adult. She's 12, 13. So I had to kind of shift to not only how a 12, 13-year-old would talk present day, but then once she's back in 1816, how did the slaves talk? So the whole dialect had to change from present day to 1816 language. So, and mine wasn't necessarily, I don't think, Black or white. It was more so her age, making sure I spoke her language, because writing for adults, I know how to speak for an adult. I'm an adult, you know what I mean? So I write, it's easier for me to write a character that's in her 40s or 50s or whatever. But I had to make sure when I wrote for this character that was 12 or 13, that it was authentic. So I would give it to younger people and say, is this something that you all would say? You know, does this sound like somebody your age? I had to make sure that she sounded like a 12 or 13-year-old and not a 40-year-old when writing for her. And then, of course, once we got into the historical fiction era, I had to make sure that I changed the dialect. It was broken then. You know, our Black slaves didn't say complete sentences or complete words. So I had to write it as such. So it's definitely a challenge, but you have to, like you said, do the research and make sure that it's authentic so that your reader understands what they're reading and can identify with what they're reading.
And even, I think one more thing, even deeper than that, we have to be, particularly with Black history, we have to be very mindful of the fact that one of the things that Reverend McCreary got on to me also about, said to me very clearly, was that people in Jackson Ward in the 1920s and 30s were highly educated. They did not speak broken English. And so I literally had to be mindful of the class of a character in some regards and the kind of language that they would use. So when I had a character do a flashback to a earlier time, then I had to make sure that language was appropriate for that time, and then bring them back, like she said, bring them back and make the language appropriate. But I had to keep in mind that I was privy to a man who was 10 years old in the ward at that time, and who remembered vividly that if you spoke improper English, you got whacked. you got in trouble. And so even though there are some phrasings in my book where the English is broken, like there's no G on the end of a word, you have to look at what character is saying that. So the old former slave woman, she talks like that. But Mrs. Johnson does not speak like that. And so, I had a reviewer who said the book had errors in it because he didn't understand that certain characters from certain time periods spoke in a different way than the current characters. So you are really literally in your research. This is why beta readers are so important and your librarians are so important, because if you're saying your book is set, saying you're having a 12-year-old girl in 1816 Goochland, Virginia, that language is going to be very different from Robin's 13-year-old girl in Philly, 1974, versus my 20-something-year-old former slave mulatto woman in Richmond, 1861.
Right.
That's
right.
Fascinating. Well, it's a 1:15, and I'd like to open up the questions to our audience. If anyone has any questions for any or all of the panelists, please unmute yourself and let us know what you're thinking. Kathy, did you have a question? You're all muted, so I can unmute you, but I think it'd be better if you can unmute yourselves.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, good. Yes,
anyway,
Kathy.
I work with Melton part-time. I'm a retired Army historian. I'm fascinated by the historical fiction. I don't read it very much, but sure am now. History. Really an admiration of your research skills. And I Really want to, Melvin and I talked about reading more fiction. So I think for me being a historian, I think historical fiction would be a natural fit. And I really do appreciate listening to you, and especially your research process. It gives me some ideas maybe for my next book. So thank you.
Very good, very good. Yeah, I think that historical fiction is fascinating, and it's amazing that you can turn out a product that is so authentic and so interesting, and it can hold the reader's imagination. Julie, did you have a question or comment?
Well, I've enjoyed this so much because, you know, it's just fascinating that people like you all can tell such a wonderful story, and that you can spend all this time writing it. And sometimes it's a year or 2 or 5 years later that we pick up your book and it's still so captivating. You know, your words still ring so true. How do you, with all the stories that you could tell, how do you kind of zone in on one?
Well, I'll say for myself, being a content creator and being a writer for so many years, when the characters start talking to you, you have to write the story. It's and I know it may sound cliche from other writers, but it actually happens to me anyway. I mean, it keeps me up at night when I have a story that I have to write. These characters have to get this story out on paper. I can't sleep. It just keeps me. And then I have notebooks all over the place. My husband, it drives him crazy, but I write down notes and everything. And then I say, you know what, this is a story that I have to write now. I have to commit to this story. Otherwise it's gonna probably worry me to death until I get it done. So then it's time to start, you know, plotting your book out, outlining and getting it done. And when it comes to you as a writer, it comes, and you just have to put it on paper. So for me, the characters make me move. They tell me when it's time, and I just go with it.
Absolutely.
Now, for me, again, this was a personal event that really shaped the trajectory of my life. It's not a coincidence that I grew up to be a journalist, to try to dig out the truth and hold powerful people and institutions accountable and amplify the voice of marginalized people. It can all be traced back to what happened to me in that classroom at age 11. So it had a profound impact on my life. And it was something that I kind of buried deep down, because back in 1973, you never, ever, ever, or seldom heard about kids hitting teachers. And you never heard about a girl hitting a nun, right? And it was a very shameful event for me. And I buried it, and I didn't even talk about it for years. And then when I was 39, and you know, when you're about to turn 40, you ask yourself all those big cosmic questions. What am I doing with my life? Where am I going? Who am I supposed to be? And I was asking these questions because I had a year-long fellowship at the University of Michigan. And at the time, I was studying screenwriting. And that's when I started thinking about what this incident did, how it shaped my life, and that could make for a really good movie, right? Because it's really a love letter to every Black girl who's been told she's too loud, too strong, and too smart. And there's an effort to shut her up. And so that's how it came about.
Yeah, I'm with LaKesa and Robin a little bit. I mean, I believe firmly in the muse. And when they give you a story, is, you know, character, even if it begins as just a line, you know, it'll I always say the muse gives it to you, and when they give it to you, you need to run with it. Because if you don't do something with it, it will take that story and it will give it to a more willing participant. And so when you have a character that is speaking to you, or an event that's speaking to you, and it won't go away, that's your sign. And for some people, you know, I've had clients who say, well, I've never had that experience, I shouldn't write about it. And my response to that is always, this is why you're living in the perfect day and age, because there's no reason why you cannot tell that story because of the technology that we have and the resources that we have. So you may not have been necessarily, you know, a 12-year-old slave girl in Goochland, Virginia in 1819, or even a young Black girl in Philly in 1973. But if the muse gives you that voice, that character, there's this thing called research. And there's this thing called beta readers that can help you craft the story and tell it, because the muse gave it to you for a reason. You just got to have the courage to be able to tell that story.
Wow, wow, fascinating. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Or any comments?
I had another question.
Sure.
I was wondering how long it took to do your research for various.
I'm an anomaly. I swear I'm an anomaly, because what I'm about to tell you about Murder on 2nd Street, y'all, I wrote that novel in 30 days because I entered the National Novel Writing Month contest. I wanted to challenge myself as a teacher who teaches literature. And so I did my first novel in 30 days, the first draft. And it was actually during the post, you know, contest, after I reached that max of 50,000 words, when I was going back and deciding if I was going to write, you know, actually publish this thing, going back and cleaning it up. And that research is where I found the story for The Secret Life of Lucy Bosman. So I took that story and again challenged myself in the following year's National Novel Writing Month contest, and I finished that first draft in 30 days. But those are just drafts, because then you have to go back and you have to do the editing and the rewriting process. So that took another couple months. And with Murder on 2nd Street, I did 2 editions of it because I wanted to fix the book cover. I wanted to make sure that I had my resources. You know, I had additional resources. I made some adjustments. So for me, you know, I'm different. Those books, Murder on 2nd Street, that story was like, it's the only story my whole entire writing career that came out fully intact, as in like I knew everything. Secret Life of Lucy Bosman, I had to work for it. My first other novels, I had to work for them, but that story was just an anomaly for me. So that's how I wrote my first 2 historic fiction pieces.
For me, it took like between 4 and 5 months to do the research before I actually started, because I had notebooks and I knew the different parts to the story that I wanted to tell, but I wanted to do the research to get the details first before I actually started writing. So between 4 and 5 months is how long it took me to do the research, going to the library and Google and finding old pictures and all of that before I actually started, before I was actually comfortable writing the story and getting the story written.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
Oh.
So fascinating. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
I had one question.
Yes.
I was wondering, I notice sometimes when I see historical fiction authors, they tend to write a lot, if that's their main, you know, genre, they often write a lot within that one time period, or they pick kind of one time period and they write a lot. But did you all find that, you know, once you did this amount of research, you wanted to write more stories from this time, or you were totally done with it, that was enough, or if it kind of like opened up the ideas for more stories within that time?
I thought I was going to be one and done, but I'm hearing from readers that they want to know what happens to my protagonist. So I guess I'm going to have to go back to the 70s at some point. But my next novel is set actually in the future. So I'm not wedded to historical fiction.
Yeah, I think it's whatever your muse gives you. Like, I mean, I'm terrible. People have been waiting for part 2 of Murder on 2nd Street for like 10 years now. And I have the idea, the story now moves into the late 1930s, headed into World War II. But I'm just like, whatever the muse tells me, wherever it needs me to go, that's the period I go to. So I'm not wedded to it, and I'm also not dismissing it. It's wherever the muse takes me. takes the character.
Yeah, I know for me, as far as this particular character, I do feel like it is a one and done for me because the story that I wanted to tell, I told it in that one book. I do know if I decide to do another historical fiction piece, it'll probably be something that's going to take me a long time because it will definitely be more adult historical fiction. If I was to go back to do something like that, I really wanted to write that book for young people after the conversation me and my daughter had. That was really the only reason that I wrote that book. But I like adult historical fiction, but I know it's going to be a long time before I do that because I know it's going to take a lot of effort into getting all the details that before I want to tell that story. So I have a lot of other stories that I have going on in my head right now that I can probably kick out before I have to write that. So, but that one is one and done definitely for me.
Interesting. Well, we've got 3 minutes left. So if there are no more questions, I'd like to wrap things up. And I guess there might be something that you're dying to tell the audience that we didn't touch upon. So if there is, this is your opportunity to say your piece, as it were. LaKesa, would you like to start?
Well, I'd just like to say that, again, I appreciate you having me. Again, historical fiction is definitely worth the wait if you can take the time after we put in all the research. I have enjoyed the other 2 panelists. I can't wait to read your stories now. I'm intrigued. But again, I do have other stories out there that I like. I love to write fiction, contemporary fiction. I love telling stories. So make sure you follow me on Instagram and Facebook under I am LaKesa on Instagram. I am LaKesa Cox author on Facebook. And then my webpage is lakesacox.com. You can check out some of my other works there. And that's it. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Robin, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, people keep saying how timely my book is, even though it's set in the 70s. But that's because certain topics are timeless. Right?
Mm-hmm.
When have we never not dealt with racism or spiritual journeys or political corruption or dysfunctional families? In the 70s, you had the Black Power movement. Today, you have Black Lives Matter. In the 70s, you had Shirley Chisholm run for president. She made Black girls stand up straighter. Today, you have Kamala Harris making Black and brown girls around the globe stand up stronger. In the book, when Roberta questions sister and her love of Thomas Jefferson, she is dismantling American mythology. Today, you have young people tearing down statues to it. You had Nixon and Watergate. Today, we have the fool that just left. So all of those echoes that are in my book are happening today, and it's because the past is a mirror to the future, right?
Absolutely.
Issues never go away. So when people say, Robin, it's so timely, how did you know? Well, if this book came out next summer, it still would be timely, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Rebekah?
All great stories are timely. I mean, all great stories, if you tell it well, if first of all, your intention for telling the story is in the right place, then the book will always be the right time. It will always be the right time. And, my thing is I just always want to encourage people. I hear people say, oh, I have an idea for a story. And I'll say, well, where is it? Oh, it's in a box in the attic. I'm like, okay, what? Again, if the muse has given it to you, it's for you. If you don't use it, they'll give it to someone else. And the last thing I think we should live, particularly that we're learning now, is that we should not live in regret. There should be no regret at the end saying, I could have, I should have, I would have. Again, if there's a story out there you want to read and it has not been written, then build your team to help you write that story and keep pushing it. I'll never forget, an agent told me, when I submitted Murder on 2nd Street to her, she said to me, this is a great story. I love the character. It's so timely. But, maybe we'll publish it after Walter Mosley dies because there's only room right now for one Black male protagonist hero. And I was like, what? And hearing that, I decided I would take my destiny into my own hands. And that's why I self-published that novel, because I shouldn't have to, and no one should necessarily have to wait for another author to die for your story to fill the space, because you know what? The space is big enough for all of us. There are a multitude of ways to tell a story. There's an audience for everything. Fill the space, get in there. And you can find me on social media all over the place too, Rebekah with a K-H.
Well, thank you, ladies. I think this is a great way to start the Black History Month 2021. It's a new year and a new outlook on things, and yeah, go for it. That's what I would say to myself. I'm writing a book, and I've been writing the same book for forever. So Rebekah, I think I'm just gonna step on out there. So thank you again. Yes, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
all so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
All right.